There is a section inside the 10th annual report of the Bureau of American Ethnology, published in 1893 and covering fieldwork conducted in 1888 and 1889, that almost no one reads anymore. It is not a suppressed document. It has never been classified or restricted or deliberately hidden. It sits in the complete run of BAE annual reports, which are available at any major research library, and which have been digitized and made freely accessible online. The problem is not access. The problem is that nobody is asking the right questions of what is in there. The Bureau of American Ethnology was established in 1879 under the Smithsonian Institution specifically to document indigenous cultures at a moment when the United States government believed those cultures were disappearing. The mandate was broad and the urgency was real. Field workers were sent into territories that Anglo-American society had barely touched. They recorded languages, ceremonies, agricultural practices, material culture, and oral tradition. They were not, as a general rule, looking for anomalies. They were conducting systematic documentation under significant time pressure, which means that when anomalies appeared in the field notes, they often got recorded without the recorder fully recognizing what they had. The 1889 Hopi field notes are a case in point. The Hopi occupied and still occupy a series of mesa-top villages in what is now northeastern Arizona. They are one of the most continuously occupied communities in North America. Their primary villages have been inhabited for somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years, placing them among the oldest continuously occupied settlements on the continent. More importantly for this discussion, they had maintained their oral traditions, their ceremonial systems, and their accounts of their own past, in a form that had not been significantly disrupted by missionary activity or forced assimilation to the degree that characterized most other indigenous communities by the time sustained outside contact occurred. What the BAE fieldworkers encountered when they began interviewing Hopi elders in the late 1880s was a tradition that had been preserved with extraordinary fidelity over a very long period of time. What that tradition said about the great structures scattered across the desert southwest, the enormous stone buildings, the astronomical alignments, the road systems, the evidence of long-distance industrial trade, was not what conventional archaeology would later want it to say. The Hopi called the people who built those structures the Hisatsinom. It is sometimes translated as the Ancient Ones, sometimes as the people of long ago. But the relationship between the Hopi and the Hisatsinom in the oral accounts documented in 1889 is not the relationship of a people to their direct ancestors. It is the relationship of inheritors to predecessors, people who came into a landscape that had already been shaped, already marked, already worked by someone else. And embedded within the tradition of the Kachina, the spiritual beings at the center of Hopi ceremonial life, is a memory of exactly who those predecessors were, what they knew, and what happened to them. To understand why that matters, you have to start with what was built, because the physical record of what exists in the American Southwest is the part of this story that nobody can argue away. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of what is now northwestern New Mexico, at an elevation of just over 6,000 feet, in one of the driest and most resource-limited environments on the continent. There is almost no surface water. The soil is poor. The growing season at altitude is unforgiving. By any ordinary logic of where a civilization chooses to locate itself, Chaco makes no sense. You would not choose this place. And yet, between roughly 850 CE and 1150 CE, a construction program began in that canyon that produced results so large, so precisely engineered, and so astronomically sophisticated that the engineers and archaeologists who have studied them for over a century have not produced a consensus explanation for how they were accomplished or why they were attempted. The largest of the Chaco Great Houses is called Pueblo Bonito. It contains roughly 650 rooms arranged across a structure that rises 4 and in some sections 5 stories. Its construction required an estimated 30,000 tons of shaped sandstone blocks, cut and fitted with a precision that modern structural analysis has confirmed was not accidental. The walls are plumb, the corners are square, the rooms follow geometric relationships that hold with consistency across the entire structure, implying either measuring instruments of some kind or a standard of spatial reasoning that the conventional characterization of ancestral Puebloan society has struggled to fully accommodate. Pueblo Bonito is one of 12 great houses in Chaco Canyon. Not one, 12. There are also at least 150 smaller associated structures in the canyon and its immediate surroundings. And outside the canyon, across an area of the Colorado Plateau roughly the size of Ireland, there are hundreds of outlier communities connected to Chaco by something that has no easy analogue anywhere else in pre-Columbian North America. Roads. The Chaco road system extends more than 400 miles in documented sections. The roads are 30 feet wide. They are perfectly straight, not approximately straight in the way that a well-maintained trail might appear straight from above. Geometrically straight, sustained over distances of tens of miles, cutting through hills rather than around them, crossing arroyos on ramps and stairways cut into the bedrock. The precision is not incidental. It is deliberate to a degree that implies surveying, planning, and the enforcement of a construction standard that someone had the authority to require and the logistical capacity to maintain. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one piece of a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different sites, different centuries, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, categorized, set aside. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Some of the roads extend past the canyon into terrain with no identified destination. They simply go straight 30 feet wide out into the desert to points that archaeology has not yet explained. The working phrase for this in the literature is roads to nowhere, used as if the failure to identify a destination is a property of the roads rather than a limitation of current knowledge. It is worth sitting with that assumption. Now consider the timber. The great houses of Chaco required an estimated 200,000 wooden beams for roofing, lintels, and structural support. Beams of ponderosa pine, spruce, and fir. There are no ponderosa pine forests near Chaco Canyon. The nearest sources are in mountain ranges 60 to 75 miles away, across high desert terrain with no rivers to float the lumber and no draft animals in pre-Columbian North America to haul it. Every one of those 200,000 beams was transported to the canyon by human labor across dozens of miles of rough country over a construction period of roughly 300 years. Researchers have traced the wood grain and ring patterns to specific source forests. They know where the timber came from. The mechanism by which it arrived in sufficient quantity to build 12 great houses remains a subject of active debate. Read those numbers together. 12 great houses, one with 650 rooms requiring 30,000 tons of shaped stone. 200,000 timber beams, each carried 60 or more miles by hand. An engineered road system covering 400 documented miles at a consistent width of 30 feet with geometric precision maintained over terrain that would challenge a modern survey crew. All of this in one of the most resource-limited landscapes on the continent. All of this accomplished within a 300-year window. The organizational capacity implied by those numbers is not the organizational capacity of a loosely affiliated collection of farming villages. It is the organizational capacity of a civilization, something with hierarchy, logistics, record-keeping, enforcement of standards and authority that extended over an enormous geographic area. The question of what that civilization was is the question the Hopi were answering in 1889. The Hopi tradition, as documented in the BAE field notes, does not describe the Hisatsinom as the Hopi's ancestors in the direct genealogical sense. That distinction is important, and it is consistently maintained across the accounts that the B-Pei workers collected. The Hisatsinom are described as a people who preceded the Hopi in the landscape, who built at a scale the Hopi explicitly distinguished from their own construction, who had knowledge that the Hopi received rather than independently developed, and who departed. The Kachina tradition is where this gets specific. In popular and academic treatment, the Kachina are usually discussed as a ceremonial system. A calendar of masked dances, a set of spiritual intermediaries, a complex and beautiful religious framework that has survived centuries of outside pressure. And all of that is real, but embedded in the Kachina tradition, in the accounts that the BAE fieldworkers recorded in 1889, is something else. The Kachina in those accounts are described in terms that carry historical content. They are associated with the time of the Hisatsinom. They are described as having taught, specifically as having taught knowledge of the sky, of the paths of the sun and moon, knowledge of water and where to find it and how to move it, and knowledge of the straight paths, the roads that connected the communities of the ancient world in ways that the Hopi described not only as travel routes, but as lines along which something other than goods moved, something for which the Hopi oral tradition uses terms that the BAE fieldworkers translated as intention, or purpose, or signal. Now hold that against what the physical evidence shows about Chaco's astronomical engineering. The Great Kiva at Casa Rinconada is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise with a precision that required sustained, systematic observation of solar movement across a specific landscape over a period of years. The corner windows at Pueblo Bonito capture the equinox sunrise at angles that required not guesswork but measurement. The Sun Dagger site on Fajardo Butte, documented in detail beginning in 1977, uses a specific arrangement of spiral petroglyphs and stone slabs to mark all 4 solar stations, the summer and winter solstices, and both equinoxes, through the movement of light across the spirals as the sun passes. The precision of the system requires sustained observation, calibration, and engineering sustained over a long period. It is not a folk calendar scratched into a cliff face. It is an instrument, built into the landscape with intention. The Hopi said that the Kachina taught the knowledge of the paths of the sun and moon as living roads, roads through the sky that ran in the same way that the straight paths ran through the desert. This was documented in 1889, decades before Anna Sophia's systematic analysis of Chaco's solar alignments, decades before the full scope of the astronomical engineering at the canyon was understood by anyone outside Hopi oral tradition. The convergence here is not loose. It is not a parallel that requires generous interpretation to see. 2 independent lines of evidence, one physical and one oral, documented through entirely separate processes separated by decades, are describing the same thing in different languages. The turquoise is the 3rd convergence, and it changes the scale of this story considerably. Chaco Canyon is the largest known repository of worked turquoise in the pre-Columbian archaeological record of North America. Excavations at Pueblo Bonito and associated structures have recovered tens of thousands of worked turquoise pieces. The quantity is not decorative. It is, in the most literal sense of the word, industrial. The turquoise at Chaco came primarily from the Cerrillos Hills near what is now Santa Fe, roughly 170 miles from the canyon. It was worked at Chaco and distributed outward through the road network and significantly beyond the road network. Beyond means far beyond. Turquoise matching the Cerrillos Hills isotopic signature has been found at archaeological sites in central Mexico. At Tula, the Toltec capital, hundreds of miles to the south, and the cylinder vessels recovered at Pueblo Bonito, when subjected to residue analysis in the early 21st century, tested positive for theobromine. Cacao, chocolate which does not grow within 1,000 miles of Chaco Canyon. What the cacao residue tells us is that Chaco was connected to Mesoamerican trade networks at a level that conventional models of ancestral Puebloan society did not predict until the physical chemistry of the vessels made it impossible to ignore. Before that finding, the question of Chaco's external connections was contested. After it, the question became how deep those connections ran. The Hopi oral tradition had been pointing toward the answer for as long as anyone had been documenting it. The Hisatsinum were not a local phenomenon. The Kachina builders were not a regional culture that happened to develop unusual architectural ambitions in a remote canyon. The straight roads that extended into destinations unknown were connecting Chaco to something that the conventional geographic frame of the American Southwest was not large enough to contain. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. Because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. This is where the Tartaria framework enters the conversation, and where, as always, we need to be careful about what is documented and what is inferred. In its most useful form, the Tartaria hypothesis asks whether there existed before the conventional historical record a civilization or network of civilizations operating at a level of organizational and technical sophistication that our standard timelines have not accounted for. A civilization that operated through networks rather than through territorial empire, leaving traces that are distributed and connected by trade routes rather than by contiguous territory, and therefore difficult to assemble into a coherent picture from within the framework of conventional regional archaeology. Chaco is a strong candidate for the kind of evidence that framework is genuinely reaching for. Not because Chaco is inexplicable in its dating or its cultural continuity with surrounding Pueblo peoples. Those things are real and documented, but because Chaco represents an organizational capacity that our models for the region were not built to describe. The road system was not in the models before it was found from the air. The astronomical precision was not in the models before Anna Sophia's work. The cacao was not in the models before the residue analysis. Each line of new evidence has pushed the picture of what Chaco was towards something larger and more connected than the previous model could accommodate. The Hopi oral tradition, documented in 1889, had a picture that accommodated all of it. Now let's spend some time on what we do not know, because intellectual honesty requires sitting with the limits. We do not know why Chaco was abandoned. Around 1150 CE, the building program stopped, the population dispersed, and the road system fell into disuse. The most widely accepted explanation is a prolonged drought documented in the tree ring record of the region, and that explanation has genuine evidential support. But drought alone does not account for everything. It does not explain why a civilization that had managed water through an elaborate catchment and distribution system for 3 centuries could not adapt. It does not explain the completeness of the departure, or the fact that the dispersing population did not return to the canyon when conditions improved. It does not explain why the knowledge required to maintain the astronomical instruments at Fallada Butte was not transmitted to the successor communities that settled nearby. We do not know what the roads were for at the level that explains their precision. We know their dimensions and their distribution. We know that some section of the road system served practical transportation of the timber and turquoise that the physical evidence documents. We do not know what justified the engineering standard of 30-foot wide, geometrically straight corridors for that purpose, when rougher and more practical routes would have served the transportation function equally well. We do not know from outside the tradition what the Kachina were. The Hopi accounts are specific, internally consistent across a long period of documentation, and maintained with evident care. but they describe beings with knowledge and organizational capacity in terms that the tradition treats as historical rather than mythological. What those beings were in physical terms is a question that the tradition carries without resolving in ways that map onto our categories. What is documented is this. The B.A.E. field notes from 1889 captured a tradition that describes the builders of the most extraordinary pre-Columbian structures in North America as distinct from the Hopi themselves, as possessed of knowledge the Hopi received, as connected to the sky and to the straight roads and to networks that extended far beyond the canyon, as having departed and left behind both the physical structures and a knowledge preserved in the ceremony and the dance and the marks cut into the rock. Point by point, the physical evidence at Chaco and across the ancestral Pueblo and landscape does not contradict what the Hopi were saying in 1889. It corroborates it. The astronomical engineering corroborates the sky road tradition. The turquoise economy and the cacao residue corroborate the tradition of builders connected to distant networks. The road system corroborates the accounts of paths that served purposes beyond ordinary transportation. The scale of construction corroborates the account of builders with organizational capacities that the Hopi explicitly do not claim for themselves. Two independent lines of evidence telling one story in two languages. Let's spend a moment on what happened to the documentation. The 10th annual report of the Bureau of American Ethnology was published, filed, cited occasionally in later ethnographic work on Hopi ceremonial systems, and then essentially set aside as an historical source on the questions that the physical evidence of Chaco has been forcing to the surface for the last 50 years. The field notes that documented what the Hopi said about the Kachina builders were treated as raw material for understanding Hopi religion, not as historical testimony about the people who built the roads. This is not a conspiracy. It is the normal operation of a scholarly paradigm, exactly what Thomas Kuhn described in 1962 when he wrote about how anomalies get absorbed and minimized rather than followed until there are too many to contain. American archaeology in the early 20th century was in the process of establishing its scientific identity by separating itself from the romantic fantasies about Atlantis and vanished master races that had cluttered the previous century's popular imagination. The separation was necessary and largely productive, but it created a reflex, a tendency to categorize any indigenous oral tradition that described sophisticated pre-contact builders as religious mythology rather than historical testimony. The Hopi accounts of the Kachina builders were filed under ceremony. That categorization is not wrong. It is incomplete. And the incompleteness has meant that for 135 years, a tradition describing the builders of one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian sites in North America has been sitting in the Bureau of American Ethnology's published record, while the debate about who built Chaco and how and why they left has proceeded without it. Jesse Walter Fuchs, who began working with the Hopi in 1890 and who produced some of the most detailed early documentation of the Kachina ceremonial system, treated the tradition with genuine scholarly respect. His focus was the ceremonies themselves, the dances, the masks, the seasonal calendar, the social organization of the Kiva societies. The historical content embedded in the tradition, the accounts of what the Kachina were in relation to the builders of the great houses and the engineers of the straight roads, was present in his notes. It was never the object of sustained inquiry. The question is not whether Fuchs was negligent. He was not. The question is whether the framework he was working within was built to see what was in front of him, and the evidence suggests it was not. There is a detail in the 1889 documentation that has stayed with me since I first read it. One of the Hopi elders describing the departure of the Kachina builders used a phrase that the field worker recorded without apparent awareness of its significance. He said that the builders did not leave because the work was finished. They left because the work could not be continued without them, and the knowledge of why it had been done could not be continued without them either. Only the form could be kept. The ceremony, the straight lines drawn in the sand during the dances, the movements that encoded what the roads had meant when the roads were active. That distinction between the substance of what a civilization knows and the form in which the memory of it can be preserved when the civilization itself is gone is one of the most precise descriptions of civilizational transmission failure I have encountered in any tradition. It is not describing catastrophe. It is not describing conquest or plague or sudden collapse. It is describing a gap. The gap between what a people knows and what the people who come after can keep of that knowing when the keepers themselves are no longer present. The Hopi kept the form. They maintained it across centuries. They handed it to the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1889, and it went into the published annual report and was filed under ceremony and remained there. The roads at Chaco are visible from satellite imagery now, picked out of the desert by the precise geometry that no natural process produces. The great houses stand in various states of stabilized ruin, visited by hundreds of thousands of people a year who walk through Pueblo Bonito's 650 rooms and ask the question the Hopi answered in 1889. Who built this, and how, and where did they go? The Hopi know what can be known when the substance has departed, and only the form remains. They know the outline, they know the direction, they know that the builders came with knowledge of the sky and the straight paths, and the long roads of trade that ran to the south and beyond, that they worked at a scale no community in that landscape has matched before or since, and that they left. They took with them whatever it was that made the roads make sense and the buildings mean more than their stonework. They left behind the form, the ceremony, the dance, the memory encoded in a tradition that a Bureau of American Ethnology fieldworker wrote into a field notebook in 1889, and which was published in the 10th annual report and which has been sitting in the archive ever since. The canyon is still there. The roads are still there. The tradition is still there. The question, as it always is whether anyone is willing to pick it up.